Who were the Brothers Grimm? Video 3. In this video, we'll be reading chapters 4 and 5. This book is a biography by author Avery Reed. A biography is a true story with only facts about the life of another person. And this biography is actually about two people who are brothers, the Brothers Grimm, Jacob Grimm and Wilhelm Grimm. Before we begin reading chapters 4 and 5, I have some vocabulary words I'd like to show you so that you can understand the story a little better. Ancient, something from long, long ago, usually something that no one uses anymore. Ancient. Foreign, from a different country, something that is different from what you are used to. Foreign. Retreated, to go away from a place, usually moving to a quieter place. Retreated. Roaming, going around to different places, no plan, just choosing as you move around. Roaming. Contribute, to put work in to help others. Contribute. Artists, people who draw, paint, or create beautiful things. Artists. Berlin, a city in the country of Germany. Berlin. Irregular, not normal, not what you would expect. Irregular. There's the word regular, and when you add the prefix "ir," it changes the meaning to not normal, not what you expect. Journal, a magazine with only facts, real true things on a certain topic. Journal. Literary, a word that describes things related to literature, stories, books, and writing. Literary. So a literary journal would be a journal or a magazine with only facts or real true things about literature, stories, books, and writing. Illustrator, a person who draws pictures for a book. Scoured, look very carefully for specific things. Foreigners, people from a different country. Occupied, when someone occupies a place, it means they live there. If soldiers occupy a place, they are forcing people to follow rules that the people don't like. Seized, take control without asking permission. Use force with soldiers and guns. Seized. Emperor, a ruler, similar to a king or a president, but someone very, very powerful. Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon is someone's name. Napoleon is his first name and Bonaparte is his last name. Napoleon Bonaparte is a famous man in history who was in charge of the country of France. Clerk, someone who is responsible for keeping papers in order in an office. Clerk. Siblings, brothers or sisters. And here are a few words from our last chapters that are also in this chapter you'll want to remember. Literature, anything to do with books, writing, or stories. University, a school you can go to after high school, can also be called college. Nobleman, in places that have a king or queen, the important friends and relatives of the king who are rich are called noble. So really quickly, here are the words to be listening for and thinking about as we read chapters 4 and 5. nobleman, university, literature, siblings, clerk, Napoleon Bonaparte, a name of a person, emperor, seized, occupied, foreigners, scoured, illustrator, literary, journal, irregular, Berlin, artists, contribute, roaming, retreated, foreign, and ancient, something from long, long ago. So let's read chapters 4 and 5 of Who Were the Brothers Grimm. After living in Paris for 10 months, Jacob returned to Kassel, where Wilhelm, their mother, and their siblings were living. Wilhelm studied for his final exams at university, and Jacob found a job as a clerk at the state's war office. War was coming. Napoleon Bonaparte was the Emperor of France. It was 1805, and Napoleon had taken control of Italy, Austria, Egypt, and Turkey, and now he was coming for Germany. Germany is not a country yet, but Germany is the place where Jacob and Wilhelm lived. It is a country now in 2018. It wasn't then. But Germany is a country, and Napoleon Bonaparte is going to come and try to take it over. If you'd like to read this section, it's a very good section about types of stories. You can pause the video here and read this if you'd like. This would be a great thing for you to pause the video and read. It'd give you a lot of important information about different types of stories. We will continue on here. On November 1st, 1806, French soldiers seized Kassel, the city where Jacob and Wilhelm's family lived, and the German noblemen fled or ran away. The brothers' aunt, who had brought them to Kassel for school, left too. So their own aunt ran away from the city where they lived. And there's the soldiers on their horses. Almost overnight, the entire town changed. French, not German, was now the language spoken in Kassel. Life became very difficult for Jacob and Wilhelm. Their home was occupied by foreigners, and their favorite aunt no longer lived nearby. The brothers felt very alone. Jacob quit his job, and Wilhelm could not find work. To take their minds off all their troubles, Jacob and Wilhelm concentrated more and more on collecting German fairy tales. They scoured libraries and bookshops for fairy tales, but they had little luck finding any. Then, in May of 1808, Dorothea Grimm suddenly died. Who was Dorothea Grimm? She was their mother. She had been the center of family life. It was her love and support that had created such a close and happy home. The brothers had lost their jobs. Now they had lost their mother too. This was the most difficult time for the Grimm family. Lottie, who is their sister, ironed clothes. Neighbors shared their food, and Jacob and Wilhelm helped with the housework. Still, they only ate one meal a day. Things began to improve when their younger brother, Ludwig, found work. He became an illustrator for a literary journal that Arnman and Bertano edited. Here you can see Jacob and Wilhelm helping wash the dishes and cook the meals because they don't have jobs and they don't have a mother to take care of the house anymore. Then, in July, King Jerome, Napoleon's brother, who now ruled Kassel. So Napoleon has come from another country and he's the one that they don't really like. And his brother, King Jerome, is in charge of their town. Napoleon's brother, who now ruled Kassel, hired Jacob to run the palace library. There were 12,000 books in the library. However, no one but the king, queen, and librarian were allowed to read them. That wasn't fair. Still, it was the perfect job for Jacob. He spent his days reading and studying, and he was paid to do it. There's Jacob Grimm reading in the palace library. Here's Wilhelm. We're about to find out something sad that was happening with Wilhelm. Wilhelm was in poor health and seemed to get worse each day. He would lose his breath after climbing a few steps. His heartbeat was very irregular. It would beat very quickly before returning to normal. Sometimes this would continue for a whole day. Getting good care was hard. In 1809, Wilhelm traveled 60 miles to a doctor in Halle. So Wilhelm is sick and they don't know what's wrong with him. And it's hard to get a doctor in the country of Germany at this time. When he wasn't being treated or resting, Wilhelm looked through all the books in the library in Halle for fairy tales. Wilhelm found some folk songs, but very few fairy tales. The brothers' collection was off to a slow start. Finally, after 6 months, Wilhelm began to feel better. So much so that he accepted Arnman's invitation to visit him in Berlin. There, Arnman introduced him to many writers and artists. So first Jacob got to go to the city of Paris, and now Wilhelm gets to go to the city of Berlin. So Arnman introduced him to many writers and artists who inspired Wilhelm to contribute to the world beyond his small hometown. This trip to Wilhelm was what Paris had been to Jacob. It opened his eyes to the larger world. In December 1809, Wilhelm returned home to Kassel. With French secret police roaming the city, Jacob and Wilhelm retreated to their study. They studied German history and literature that was written hundreds of years earlier. Many of the books they wanted to read were in old and foreign languages, but Jacob and Wilhelm were not bothered by this. They simply taught themselves to read over 10 languages, both ancient and modern. And they did all of this without language guides or textbooks. Of all the literature they read, Jacob and Wilhelm loved reading fairy tales the best. Many smart people thought fairy tales were simple and childish. The Grimms, however, believed that fairy tales were hidden treasures of German culture and values. The brothers wanted to remind people what it meant to be German, even while under French rule, and especially during a time of war. They thought saving German fairy tales was a way to do it. But if fairy tales weren't in bookstores and libraries, where could the brothers find them? Chapter 5. Collecting Fairy Tales. One day, Arnhem sent Jacob and Wilhelm 2 fairy tales. A storyteller had told these stories by heart from memory. The juniper tree was the story of an evil stepmother who kills her stepson. The fisherman and his wife was the story of a poor fisherman and his greedy wife who is never satisfied with the gifts they receive from a magical fish. That sounds like an interesting fairy tale to read. Up until this point, Jacob and Wilhelm had been trying to find fairy tales in books. Now they had 2 authentic German fairy tales directly from a storyteller. Jacob and Wilhelm decided to look for other storytellers and write down their tales exactly as they told them. So there's a woman taking care of a bunch of kids, telling stories just with her words to them without having them written in a book yet. And that's what Jacob and Wilhelm decided to look for. Before people used writing to record information, they handed down their history, beliefs, and way of life by telling stories. Fairy tales were important. Not only did they provide entertainment, they also taught children about growing up. Fairy tales were about facing challenges and overcoming them. No matter how big a giant might be, or how scary a dragon is, the hero is always able to defeat it. As more people learned to read and write, fewer and fewer cultures told stories from memory. The Grimms were educated young men who were trained to find information in books. Unfortunately, no one had thought fairy tales were important enough to write down. The brothers now realized that they needed to go to the source, the storytellers. Cinderella had been told for hundreds of years in many European countries, even before French author Charles Perrault wrote down his version. In each country, the story had a different title and the characters had different names. It was Perrault who added the pumpkin carriage, the fairy godmother, and Cinderella's glass slipper to the story. In the German version that the Grimms found, Cinderella does not have a fairy godmother, but receives help from a wishing tree that grows on her mother's grave. So different fairy tales were different in different places. There's the wishing tree growing on her mother's grave, and there's Cinderella. Have you ever read a version like that? The Grimms thought Perrault had done a good job, but they wanted a collection of German tales. They didn't have to go far to find storytellers. Local women seemed to be the best sources for stories. The Grimm's next-door neighbor, Herr Wild, had 4 daughters who all loved folk tales. Herr Wild is a person's name. Wild is their last name. The Wilds passed along many of their stories to the brothers. Even the Wilds' nanny and housekeeper, Marie Mueller, or Old Marie, contributed several stories. So you can see there the Brothers Grimm going next door to their neighbor's house asking Herr Wild to tell them her stories. And her nanny, Marie, also contributed several stories. One of them was the German version of Little Red Riding Hood, called Little Red Cap. Another pair of sisters, Amalie and Jeanette Hassenpflug, knew a dozen stories, including several of the most famous, Briar Rose, Tom Thumb, and Snow White. Amalie and Jeanette are both names, and those are people who told them some of the stories. Soldiers, farmers, and fishermen also told tales to the brothers. A retired soldier told Jacob several stories in exchange for a pair of pants. So Jacob had to give him a pair of pants, and then he told him a bunch of fairy tales. The soldier later told Jacob that he thought of him twice a day, whenever he was putting on and taking off his pants. So there's Jacob giving the soldier a pair of pants, and the soldier telling him all the fairy tales he heard as a kid. This is a little section about Charles Perrault. If you would like to read that, that's a great piece of information, and you can pause the video and read that if you'd like to read about Charles Perrault. Does this picture look familiar, like any book or story that you've ever read in the past or seen a movie of? Then read about Charles Perrault to find out who that is. For 6 years, the Grimms worked on the fairy tales. It took time to collect the stories and then to organize and edit them. In 1812, Arnhem visited the Grimms. When he read their manuscript, he immediately set off to Berlin to find a publisher. So a manuscript is a story or a book that has not been put into a book yet. And Arnhem loved it so much, he wanted to make sure it got put in a book. A publisher is a person who takes what someone has written and gets it in books, printed in lots of copies so that other people can read it. And when he read their manuscript, he immediately set off to Berlin to find a publisher. George Andreas Reimer agreed to make the Grimms' 86 stories into a book. Just 5 days before Christmas, Children's and Household Tales by the Brothers Grimm was published. So published means it was put in a book, like bound, like a book like that we're used to, and put in bookstores and libraries for people to read. So I hope that you've enjoyed this chapters 4 and 5 of Who Were the Brothers Grimm, a biography by Avery Reed. I'm just going to quickly put these words up here, and if you need to read the definitions again, you can pause the video on each word to read it. Ancient, foreign, retreated, roaming, contribute, artists, Berlin, irregular, journal, literary, illustrator, scoured, foreigners, occupied, seized, emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, clerk, siblings, literature, university, nobleman. Come back and join us for chapters 6 and 7 in the next video.